Hey everyone, Tracy Austin here, host of the Talent Optimization podcast. I am thrilled to announce that we have joined forces with a People Forward network, and we will be getting a new look, a new podcast name, and a bit of a new format for our podcast going forward. We're very excited to be talking with executives and CEOs about how they're creating the people strategy inside of their organization as they uplift and up-level both the people and the organization to reach those key business outcomes. So with that, I've really reflected on the past 130 episodes and want to highlight a few as favorites. I'd love to hear what you take away from this one. Have a great rest of your day.
Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, Predictive Index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to Talent Optimization with Tracy Shirk. Today we are talking about how to create dream teams inside of our organization, and within those dream teams, how we have our teams actually manage themselves. And with us today, we have Mike Zani, and Mike is the CEO of Predictive Index. Mike, welcome to the show.
Tracy, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I have to say, Mike, you have inspired not only my business, but you have inspired me in what I do and how I serve others by really engaging individuals where they are with their strengths. And I'm super curious, how throughout your career have you pulled on strengths to really engage people in the work to be done?
It's interesting. I think when I was a coach for the U.S. sailing team, I had an opportunity to meet Tim Gillickson, who was Pete Sampras's coach. And we shared a table at a dinner, an award. We were both nominated for Coach of the Year for our respective disciplines. So when I'm talking to him, I mean, I was a sailing coach, so he was probably less psyched to be sitting near me than I was to be sitting near, a tennis coach of Pete Sampras. But we got to talk about strengths and weaknesses. It was interesting, his little story about, Pete Sampras and how he won and the data and analytics behind that. Because we were talking, and we pulled in the other people at the table, but we talked about how much time do you spend, really refining your strengths versus sort of nitpicking and bolstering your weaknesses. And he was a big proponent of really spending more time on the strengths and trying to play the game in your strengths. And the little anecdote and story that he used was, and I'm going to paraphrase the numbers because I do not remember the numbers from, 1996 exactly, but he was like, Pete Sampras is one of the greatest serve and volley tennis players in the world. And the serve and volley is set up by the first serve. If you serve really powerfully, your competitor has a weak return. And ideally, Pete Sampras charges the net and end of point. And, when you look at the game, you'd say, wow, Pete has a weakness with his ground strokes because he's such a good serve and volleyer. He should work on his ground strokes. And Gillickson was like, no, they're missing it. This whole thing is set up. If his serve goes in greater than 65% of the time, first serve, he always wins. And then if it's like 55 to 65, he's in the game. If it's below 55, he's beatable. So he goes, we practice a lot of first serves. And that's how Sampras plays the game in his strength. And it's interesting that really informed me, one as an athletic coach, and then when I got into management, of how do we make sure that all of your employees, all of your team members, all of your coworkers are playing the game of business and specifically the work that you need to do. How are they playing that game in their strength? So if I assign an employee, hey, we need a PowerPoint deck for this presentation in 2 weeks, I shouldn't apply the way I would attack the deck. I need to make sure that they feel empowered to attack the deck the way they would so that they can be their best self as represented by that deck. And I think that lesson applied to business is really powerful. And leaders and managers have such authority in this to help their players, one, identify their strengths and then play the game in their strengths.
Thank you so much for that example, because we see that happen day in and day out, right? And especially when we have self-managing teams, they're determining how they do that work and just focused on what is the outcome we're looking for, right? What's the outcome at the end of the day? So I love that. One of the things you state in your book that was just released, Dream Teams, is there's this quote that I love, and it says, "A coach can help set goals, attack weaknesses, bolster strengths. A coach can keep the dark secrets, help dig deeper to find the sources and mold a response." And as I was listening into the story that you were just telling, and some of those situations where we see individuals that are on these self-managing teams do things really, really well, it's because they're really allowed to do that, but they also have that place where they can go to say, hey, help me work through this thing where it's not managing.
Yeah, I do think that these self-managing teams have to have an openness and a trust and a willingness to be transparent and vulnerable. Say you have a self-managing team and the topic is finance. Does that mean the CFO, if they're on this team, or maybe it's the controller who has the most background in finance and accounting, should have an outweighted say? And a lot of teams tend to do that. They go, well, this is your area of expertise, so you dictate what's going on. Whereas there could be some, you're like, I know the most about finance, but I'm really not good at presentations. Maybe the presentation person should work on the story arc. And I'm just trying to make sure that we're telling the right story financially. If the team is not open and transparent about their strengths and weaknesses and each role, or if they don't have power to push back on, say, the CFO and say, hey, CFO person, that's really a boring story, which you don't often get away with that with the C-suite. But if the CFO is being really brutally honest, they might be like, I'm not a great storyteller. How about you architect the story? I'll architect the finance. And you can have these blissful ahas, but only if the team has that dynamic of trust and openness and respect and transparency to get there.
Absolutely. And when you're looking at that, that trust and transparency to get there, you have to have agreement over what are we doing and why are we doing it, right? What is our strategy and what are those outcomes we're driving towards? Because if we don't agree with the why of what we're doing, it's not going to matter anyways.
That's right. You can have all sorts of, circular discussions if you're not in agreement on what is it we're trying to accomplish, which was why in our sort of team discovery module at the Predictive Index that we really made sure there's no good or bad teams. There just might be good or bad fit for the work. So we had to develop this whole module on how do you define the work that needs to be done, which was really fun and exciting to do because it helped people with, what is the strategy and how do we best accomplish it?
Right. And I have to say, the framework that you created out of that made it so fun to work with organizations on what is it we're actually doing. Because what I'm finding when I'm working with our clients is there is so much disagreement over the work to be done that they can't even get off that first spot, which is why they've been getting stuck. So the framework really does allow for that agreement of here's the work we're doing, here's the outcomes that we're looking for, right? And that's really different than what an output is. Like, hey, we're going to have a meeting. Well, who cares, right? I want to know that we're going to get XYZ done at the meeting.
Oh, I agree. And when you get a group of people in the room, one, it surprises you on how misaligned you can be. And as a CEO, I used to get mad. I took it as a personal affront. I'm like, how could we be this misaligned? We spend so much time and effort trying to get aligned. I view this as a failure, an abject failure of my number one responsibility. So I used to get mad. And then I realized, well, people are bringing their own pet projects to bear or from their perspective. I mean, say if you are in operations, the importance of having world-class operations is probably first and foremost. So you overweight those things, so once you peel back pet projects and then sort of me issue sort of perspectives, you can really, well, stop talking past each other and then start really refining. You go, maybe we don't need world-class operations this year. Maybe
Right.
these 30 things are more important, and we'll work on the operations in phase 2. And it's those conversations. And I think the tools make it more objective instead of just being like, Tracy, you and I keep having this argument, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, you're just lobbing grenades at each other versus having an objective way to say, you bring up a really good point. If we work on your thing first, mine becomes
Right.
easier.
And I think that there's a point where there are going to be really positive disagreements because we're coming to it from very, very different directions, and both are valid, but they're not valid for the prioritization of the project at the time. And I remember the first time my executive director at the time said that to me. I'm like, but I don't understand. I just want to run this thing. And she's like, hold on, back up, right? Like, let's just look at the different perspectives, because when we can see that, we can also see where we're going, but we're in alignment to it so we can work together. I was like, oh, that was a light bulb. And one of the other things, Mike, that I appreciated out of your Building Dream Teams book was you have an engagement by performance 2x2, where you have some really fun names in here for kind of where individuals are inside of the engagement and performance metrics inside of an organization. And as we're talking about these dream teams and making sure that we're on the same page to actually get to those end results, one of the things is really clear is if we don't have engaged folks on our team that are also performing, that's not going to happen. But what do you do with those disengaged individuals? And so I'm super curious about these 4 kind of quadrants that you have talked about and created, and how this fits into creating really strong dream teams.
Well, Tracy, the language that I use in the book is maybe even a bit sensational. I would first like to say I wouldn't use these names with the actual people.
You mean you can't call them a contaminator, Mike?
No, you're like, hey, you're in the contaminator bucket, and we need to do something about that. Yeah, so to share with your audience the 4 buckets, we've got a simple 2x2 matrix where you have engagement high or low, and you have performance high or low. And seems really simple. The trick is, how do you determine that? We'll get into that in a second, but let's define the buckets. So in the high bucket, you have your, cultural champions. These are the people that are a joy to manage, high performance. They're very engaged. They're really the fabric of your organization, and you need to feed them. And one of the classic mistakes is underfeeding your star performers, and then they leave. And that's really dangerous because they are so important. Then let's go to the low. That was the contaminator. I mean, this is someone low performance, low engagement. They're dragging the organization down. And this is a very tough thing to fix, because not only do you have to improve engagement, which is not easy, you have to improve performance, which is also not easy. You've got this double not easy dilemma. But these contaminators are really toxic to the environment. And if you let them fester, it can breed further contamination, which is why we use that sort of hyperbolic name. Right. I think we even use the symbol for, nuclear radioactivity there in the book. Then we go to the low performance but high engagement, and we've identified these as silent killers. Let me just give you an example. This is the one where, Monday after the football game, where someone walks around and talks to everyone until lunchtime and does very little work, and is a great office presence from an energy perspective, loves the company, maybe even dyed in the wool towards the team colors, but they're not actually moving the ball forward through work. And while if you have occasionally that, it really doesn't create the silent killer. But if someone's doing that a lot, people on your team know who the high performers are. And when you let someone get away with continual low performance, it'll beg your high performers, why do I work so hard? Why am I working after dinner? Or, why am I, fielding a client call on my PTO? And I'm not advocating that should be the definition of high performance, but people always remember when they went above and beyond. And it always calls into question, if you let low performers get away with it, why should I do it? day in and day out. And it can drag back the culture of performance that you want to create. So you really need to make sure that silent killers are in some sort of corrective action. So they are improving their performance over time. Because at least if a high performer sees a lower performer making progress and working on it, it doesn't have that silent killing effect. And then I say for last is my favorite, is the high performers, low engagement. We call them grinders. And these grinders are your biggest opportunity. You know, you can walk into someone's office and say, you are a standout performer. You are so important in the organization. I want to make sure I understand how I could make you more engaged with the company. You know, it could be me, your manager. It could be a peer and a fouled relationship. It could be aspects of your job. It could be, you know, connection to the mission. If you can unlock that source of disengagement, they're real. Just even asking the question will move engagement north, usually. And if you can crack this, and it can happen quickly, you know, but it has to be real change. It can't be a palliative that says, oh, I listened to you and then everything went back to normal. But your grinders, you can turn your grinders into cultural champions. Now, what we did in our organization is we had pretty high engagement. So we actually had to sort of force rank this stuff. And we knew performance and we knew engagement. We bumped these two data sets together. We did it in a sort of blind way. And then once we had that, we had action for managers to talk to their people about this and say, we really want to pull your engagement up in a systematic way. So it gives you a great way to take action. And the reason this is so important to us, and an anecdote I do put in the book, is if you read Glassdoor for the Predictive Index, and if you read our last 3 years engagement surveys, and if you read our exit interviews, there's a theme. We move too fast. And if you listen to this theme, you'd be like, wow, you know, we lose too fast. And it's creating an unhealthy environment for people who mentioned our Glassdoor and the engagement survey. And then when we bumped it up against engagement and performance, we realized there was an even quieter message, the message that we're not moving fast enough. And that message was coming from our cultural champions, our high engagement, high performance. So if we unintentionally listen to the silent killers and contaminators who are saying, hey, you move too fast, versus listening to your cultural champions who said, no, we need to move faster. And you're like, could you imagine tapping the brakes, appeasing the low performers, low engagement, and disenfranchising your high performers, high engagement? Like, that would be a tragic mistake. And that's why you can't listen to everyone's feedback equally. And I know from a fairness perspective, you're like, that seems wrong. But if you're trying to run a world-class team, I suspect LeBron James has more time with the coach and influence than, you know, the rookie who just, you know, is sitting on the end of the bench.
Or let's talk about the Bucks for a second, right? I mean, we are in Wisconsin here, Mike. No, I'm kidding.
Let's talk about Giannis. Giannis has, when he says this is going right and this isn't going as right to the coach at halftime, his comments carry more weight because he's more than 1/5 of a player on the offense and defense when he's on the floor.
Absolutely. And one of the things I love about kind of how you just walked through this, whether it was with, you know, LeBron or Giannis or what you have done within Predictive Index, is listening into what individuals are truly saying compared to their performance. Because what we see so often when we go inside organizations before we've introduced Predictive Index is, hey, we're doing these climate surveys, yet we're not looking at performance at all. So we're just listening to the facts. And I'm going, well, wait a second, you're missing a complete set of data that's truly going to inform the reasons why. So these contaminators and the silent killers inside the organizations, if they're not producing, why are we listening to them? And I don't mean that from a mean way, but we need those performers inside the organization. The other thing that we find, and I'm curious for your take on this, is especially with the silent killers, is before we come into an organization and bring, you know, a tool like Predictive Index in, individuals aren't always in the right seat. So sometimes we can look at that and say, okay, you know what, you're super engaged, but you're in a role that is just completely draining you. And sometimes there's some quick fixes when you're first introducing a tool like Predictive Index.
You made something very clear, the importance of performance. I wanted to bring back to, so we started talking about sport, and for the members of the audience who don't like sports analogies, I'm sorry. I was a former coach. I apologize. I think it's important. So even a casual sports fan, on Monday morning after a football game, we and all the pundits on talk radio and all the fantasy sports people start beating up the assessment of the game. And if you have a quarterback who's not getting the job done in 2 or 3 weekends, you are calling for their head. You're like, we need a new quarterback. And we are brutal with our sports teams. We are calling for their heads. We want a replacement. We want them off the team. And even people who did it for us 3 years ago and maybe brought us to some sort of glory 3 years ago, they're not immune to having their head chopped off by the pundits. So we're brutal in sport, but we don't do that in business. We let average performance stick around for years. And I'm not saying let's be brutal in business, but I am saying performance is a very credible thing to bring into the equation when you're trying to create world-class companies, world-class teams. Because if you let it fester, this lower performance, you're risking the mission. What are we trying to do? What is the work that we're trying to do? And disenfranchises people. We've got to bring in this culture of performance into companies. And that brings up the point of sometimes you need to make these low performers, especially the low engagers, alumni. You're trying to make them happy alumni, but they need to be alumni. And I talk a lot about how to make happy alumni. It's not easy. It is a very worthwhile cause, and you can do it if you create a sort of an engine to do so. Because just because someone's not engaged in your company or maybe not a fit for their role, that doesn't mean they're a bad person. And it doesn't mean that they should be, destitute. So you can make happy alumni systemically, but these people are going to succeed at another person's company.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing up that happy alumni, because with those happy alumni, it's that path outside of the organization that still ensures that you keep your brand, intact, but also ensures that you're meeting your performance indicators. And we've kind of gone in a circle here today a little bit. We started with coaching and then kind of came back to, hey, what's engagement and performance? So I want to circle back to coaching just for a second. And when we're talking about bringing in coaching and ensuring we have, self-managing teams, one of those things that's really important with self-managing teams is you really have to have those cultural champions on the team. Self-managing teams don't necessarily work when you have individuals with low performance and low engagement. Thoughts on that at all?
I do think culture is really a little bit of aspirational design. You can try and build a culture, but it's not your culture until your people embrace it. Those self-managing people who become the internal coaches, they're the ones who need to say, hey, that's great, but that's not really the culture of how we do things around here. You've succeeded when you hear people talking about your cultural mores, your values in the hallway when they think no one is listening.
Right.
When you hear that, you're like, and honestly, it could be wrong. It could be like, I don't want that to be the cultural more. So you have to capture it. And you see great examples like Wells Fargo, where a once great bank created a culture of meeting your goals at all costs. And that created a toxic environment, which enabled people to think it was okay to be somewhat fraudulent. I talked to the chief people officer at Wells Fargo 2 years after that happened. And they were like, we've got years of cleanup to do because of how the culture unintendedly ran amok.
Right. And I think we saw that really strongly throughout the pandemic. I just had an interview with Cheryl Johnson, the chief people officer for Paylocity, and what she was saying was
we really had to model exactly what we were looking for to our people. She's like, so, I'm holding this all staff meeting with staff across the entire organization, and my son comes in and is on video, and, making that okay as we're working through this, but still producing high quality work is something that becomes really important. We have to model what that is, because at the end of the day, that culture is those behaviors that we allow or don't allow, and that kind of goes through every layer inside of our organization.
There's a new topic here, and I think Cheryl's spot on. We're coming back to a hybrid work.
Right.
And we intentionally told the senior management team, we cannot all come back to work 4 and 5 days a week if we're going to signal to the organization that it's okay to work hybrid or even fully remote. And we have to demonstrate best practices at running world-class hybrid meetings. Because if we don't, then we're going to go back to these old bad habits where the conference room table dominates the meeting, or people think they need to have FaceTime. So even though I might want to come to the office 3 and 4 days a week, I don't. I'm trying to make sure that I come to the office 2 or 3 days a week, because, if the boss is here, I should be here. Versus
Right.
someone comes in and says, no, the boss or the senior leadership is taking this seriously. So you Cheryl's spot on. You do have to live that culture. But senior leadership comes up with, I would love the culture to be like this. They don't get 100% of it. They get some hopefully high number, 80% of it. But they have to keep tuning it and refining it. But getting back to your point of these self-managed teams, it's celebrating those cultural drivers within the team who are doing the coaching at all levels of the organization. That's when you really know you're winning that cultural design game.
Absolutely. So, Mike, as we bring this in, I always like to talk about what's one key takeaway that our executive and CEO listeners can take away from our conversation today.
One thing,
I know. Good luck, right?
My one thing, if I had to say one thing, is if you are not taking talent optimization seriously, the biggest competitor to talent optimization is doing things the old way. Unstructured interviewing off of resumes, bringing your own conscious and unconscious biases to bear in how you hire and manage people and how you assemble teams. And the question I ask is, does your chief people officer report into the CEO? And if we don't have a chief people officer, okay, who's your most senior HR, people ops, talent person in the organization, and who do they report into? And you learn about this organization. And if the chief people officer does not report directly into the CEO, they're not doing talent optimization. And it's very clear how seriously they take it. I just spoke to a CFO yesterday. They lost their chief people officer like 4 months ago, and they're in no hurry to backfill this position. And I was like, you got a lot of work to do. Your CEO does not believe that this is important. And the CFO is like, completely agree. So, how does even a CFO convince the CEO that this is the most important lever they need to push? So I think that's the one thing, is look deep into your organization and find out, are you taking talent optimization as a company seriously? And if you're not, how do we get on a pathway to do that?
Awesome. And now I'm going to flip the table a bit here and say, what's that one takeaway for our human resource professionals listening in, whether it's that entry-level HR person or it's that chief people officer inside the organization? What's one key takeaway for them?
I think that this is a long journey. You don't go from zero to hero in talent optimization overnight. Rare people can, and rare organizations can, but this is a new discipline. Adopt and embrace the discipline, start evangelizing in your own organization, go on this journey, and it will be really meaningful for you. So when you're interviewing for your next job, that you could say, we had a company that wasn't quite on board with optimizing talent, but I went on a 2.5-year journey and brought us from here to here. And even if you do that from an individual contributor or manager director role, I mean, that is truly meaningful. You moved the needle in an organization. And that is an aspirational thing to do And you can even bring talent optimization to your home life. If you're a member of a club or a church or YMCA board, you can bring that in, and that too is meaningful.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a bit more about kind of this journey of talent optimization, some of those key points to it, whether it's, looking at engagement and performance, the coaching piece of it. Any kind of last words you have for our audience?
No, Tracy, I thank you for having me. It's been a treat to talk about talent optimization and the book, The Science of Dream Teams, which, just recently came out. And thank you for reading it and embracing some of its content. I just hope people took a nugget away from this and, go on this journey, because it's important for us to make a better world by making better workplaces.
Absolutely. And if you're looking to find more out about Mike Zani and the Predictive Index, we will have that information in our show notes. And if you are super curious about what is Predictive Index, what does this assessment kind of work look like, especially when we create dream teams, how do you create dream teams? I will have a link there as well. And I'd be happy to have a conversation with you on that, or one of our consultants as well. So you will also find that in the show notes, because this is definitely one of those journeys that is so incredibly rewarding. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.